It is not so easy looking back to know when it started, but I do know how it is now, at this time in my new life. Much of what I remembered from my childhood has also been confirmed later by an aunt of mine, my mother's sister. I do seem to remember being a girl as I grew up, which suddenly all stopped when I was about 8 years old. My Aunt Betty, Mum's younger sister, told me shortly after my mother died that my mother had for the first 8 years of my life brought me up as a girl. When I was born, my father had long gone from my mother's life, and that as a baby and small child I was always being mistaken for a girl, because of my small stature and delicate features and the fact that my hair was curly and very fair. My mother's only family was her sister Betty, whom she was close to, and who knew that I was born a boy. Between them they decided to call me Alex as it was an androgynous name. So taking my mother's maiden name, which as she had never married, suited both of us, I was named Alex Hunter, and she introduced me to her few friends as her daughter, and because of my appearance it was never questioned. My aunt also went along with the story. So began my life as a girl. My mother and several other mums had decided to home educate their children until they needed to go to middle school at the age of 9 years. As I grew older, I never lost that delicate feminine look and appearance. It seems that I was always very girly and loved my party dresses and pretty undies. The other mothers it seemed had no idea that I was not a proper girl, or if they did not say anything. My aunt often said that even in just my panties and cami top, my boy bulge was almost invisible due to my tiny genitals, plus a bit of puppy fat. Just after my 8th birthday, my mother and aunt had news that they would have to move to another part of the country as they had inherited a small holding, with a large sum of money to go with it, provided they lived there. So my mom and Aunt Betty had to decide to move and to come to terms that I would have to become the boy that I was born, as all my papers had shown me as born male, and that it was time for me to live as that boy. I not only had to now dress in boys' clothes but also have to have my hair cut, which for me was like being punished for something I had never done, and it took several months apparently for me to calm down and to be able to fit in with my new surroundings at school and at the small holding. At first it seemed it was very difficult for me to be a normal boy, as I still had that feminine appearance even dressed as a boy. So at the age of 8 years old I had to start again, but this time as a boy. School at first was okay, but as I entered college I became quite isolated and lonely. I made a few friends amongst the girls, but the boys seemed to find me an easy target for their macho bullying. I did however go on to uni and qualified with several degrees. I still lived with my mother and Aunt Betty on the small holding until I went to uni. For some reason my mother never ever mentioned about my starting life as a girl, or showed me any photos of my childhood. At uni, I got on well with many of the female students and a few of the male students. After I finished my courses and got my degrees, I started work in a large company in the city as an accountant. I now had my own apartment and only went back to my mom and Aunt Betty at holiday weekends and holiday breaks. By now I had let my hair grow quite long again, and as I had never really had the usual male puberty bit, so even as an adult I was still only 5 foot 2 inches, with no body or facial hair, which for me at the time was a bit embarrassing, as I was often mistaken for a girl by those who did not know me. I still had the soft features and small frame, and my voice had not broken, so although not a girl's voice, it was certainly not masculine. I never had much in the way of sexual libido either for girls or boys. I was just not interested. I did have a few friends of both sexes though, as I loved going to the theater and music concerts, and found like-minded others who went to the same places as myself. Some who I met regularly and some from work, who I got to know. It was about a year after I had started work that I met Sarah, who seemed to be smitten with me from the start. A few months later we moved in together, and I introduced her to my mother and Aunt Betty. Sarah was slightly older than myself, and was bigger by several inches and heavier by 14 pounds. My mother and auntie liked her from the start. Within a year Sarah and I were married. We were both very happy. Apart from the little thing of our sexual relations, I was not very active in that department, and in fact I was still very small in that I had hardly any noticeable penis and ball sack. But as Sarah herself had said many times, sex for her was not important, it was the person. Shortly after this my mother was taken ill, and sadly died within 6 months. I was devastated. Sarah naturally came with me for my mother's funeral, and we both stayed on for a week afterwards with my aunt. One evening we were reminiscing over several bottles of wine that I mentioned that I had distinct early memories of being dressed as a girl, but thought I had dreamt it all. My aunt went all quiet and said, "Alex, I think you should see the family photo album." I was shocked as I never knew we had one. She produced the album from the loft storage area. It was full of photos of my mother and Aunt Betty as young women and a little girl, who grew more pretty as she grew older, playing with other children and all dressed in pretty dresses and party clothes. The caption under all the photos read, "Alex with Betty or Mary, my mother's name, or just Alex with other children's names." I looked at my aunt, who was silently crying. "What is it, Auntie?" I asked her, quite concerned. She replied, "Alex, the little girl in the photos was in fact you growing up," she told us. She went on to explain how after I was born, and with just my mother and herself around, and how everyone thought that I was a girl baby, my mother decided that I would be her daughter. Then one day just after I was 8, they both realized that they could not keep up the pretense any longer, when out of the blue came the answer to their worries. The small holding and a sizable sum of money came to them from a long-distant relative, whose only descendants were my mother and Aunt Betty. Sarah, after hearing this story, said now she understood what it was that attracted her to me. It was my innate femininity, and that she was my surrogate mother. After we had got married, Sarah and I had bought a big 4-bedroom detached house at the edge of town, with a lovely big garden. We had a gardener come in several times a week to look after it for us. I found though after a few months that I seemed to be getting gradual changes to my body. I did not notice at first, but gradually I noticed small changes. I seemed to be developing a bust. It was almost too big to ignore, so Sarah suggested I wear a bra, and as hers were too big, she bought me a starter set, 32 cup and matching panties. I had never developed much body hair, more of a soft downy layer, on my arms, legs and underarms. Plus I seemed to be filling out on my hips area. My hair, which I had always worn in a longer style, seemed to be getting thicker and fuller. When I finally mentioned it to Sarah, she hugged me and said, "Oh, darling, you are changing into a girl again." She admitted that for the last 6 months or so, she had been giving me female hormones, to bring my body in line with my own femininity. Sarah went on to explain that shortly after we were married, she was in the ladies' powder room at work, and in one of the stalls, when she heard 2 of the other office girls come in. She heard one of them mention my name, Alex, so listened to what they might say. This powder room had an outside window that many of the girls who smoked often used, as the smoke would be drawn outside if they smoked standing by the open window. Sarah did not recognize who the 2 women were at first, but one of them said, "Well, Alex and Sarah getting married was a surprise, as I always thought Alex was a bit feminine, and would be more attracted to boys rather than girls," when the other woman remarked that perhaps Sarah wanted a girl rather than a husband. That caused them to both giggle as they left the powder room. That, Sarah said, got her to thinking, if they were right and that I should have been a girl, then she might make slow changes to see how I reacted, and if favorable she would make me her daughter. It was several months after this that we invited Aunt Betty to come and live with us, as her house and small holding was getting too much for her to look after, now that she was alone. After selling the house and land, she had enough money to have a comfortable retirement, so moving in with Sarah and I was a sensible solution, and as it later turned out, brought a whole new life for me. Aunt Betty noticed straight away the changes that had happened to me since we last met. Over the last 6 months, as my body became more feminized, it also became clear that staying with the company that Sarah and I worked for could no longer be considered an option, so I left the company, but of course Sarah stayed on there. With the internet and broadband connection, it meant that working from home gave me a much wider scope, so I quickly built up a private business working purely from home for the time being. As my female body developed, Sarah and Betty both agreed that I should live again full-time as a girl. But this time, Betty suggested that I should be the teenage girl that I missed out on. I was not convinced that I could possibly pass as a teenage girl, considering that I was now 23 years old. So Sarah suggested that we put it to the test. Sarah would purchase for me, the next time she was in town, a set of college uniforms for a 16-year-old student. She bought me white ankle socks, a local college green and dark blue pleated knee-high skirt, with matching blazer showing the badge on the breast pocket, cream-colored cotton shirt and college tie and black leather shoes. That evening I changed into the uniform Sarah had bought. I was already wearing the bra and panties I usually wore, so with the ankle socks and black shoes, and my hair done into bunches on either side of my head, like some of the college girls wore theirs. They took several photos of me. When they put them up on the computer screen, I had to admit I did look like a typical college teenager. The next day was Thursday, so Betty volunteered to take me into town with her and buy me some girls' clothes suitable for a 16-year-old girl, and we would meet with Sarah for coffee at Starbucks at lunchtime. The next day, after parking her car, Betty and I, now dressed as the 16-year-old teenager, went to browse the shopping center. One of the popular shops for the older teenage girls was Next and H&M's clothes shop. As we browsed through the dresses on the size 14 clothes racks, an assistant came over to ask if she could help. Betty smiled at the woman and said, "Oh yes, please, I am trying to find something suitable for my niece here, for her first college dance." "Of course, madam." Then smiling at me, she asked, "Would you have any particular style in mind, miss?" Then appraising me from head to feet, she asked, "Do you know your size, miss? And do you have the right undergarments as well?" I said, "I think I am a size 12 or 14, but I only have a bras and panties." Betty was very pleased with the help we were getting, and asked the assistant, "Is it possible to take my niece's measurements and to find her some nice undies as well as dresses?" "Certainly, madam. Would miss come with me to the fitting room, please?" We both followed her to the fitting rooms. She indicated a cubicle for me to go into and asked me to take off my top so she could measure me. When I was down to my panties and socks, she asked if she could come in. I said, "Yes." "Oh my," she said, "you have such a lovely body." Then she began taking measurements and writing them down in her book. She measured under my bust and around my breasts, making notes as she went. Then she measured my hips and waist, then my body length and my leg length. As she measured me, she gently brushed the back of her hand over my budding breasts and down my tummy, saying how lovely to be so young and beautiful. It was a funny feeling as she torched me. I just smiled at her, and she smiled back, and caressed my bottom through my panties. At her touch I let out a soft mew and arched my back. I caught her looking longingly at my pert little breasts. She seemed to pull herself together and asked me to wait a moment while she went to find some undies for me. She came back with several sets of bras and panties, in different materials and colors and patterns. She asked Betty to join us in the fitting area, while I tried on the bras. She drew the curtains to the fitting room, as she left to find some dresses. While I slipped on a matching nylon panty to the bra I was wearing, and when Betty saw the results, she said, "Oh my Alex, you're turning into a beautiful young woman." The assistant came back with several dresses for me to try on, and with my comfortable fitting bra giving me a shapelier bust, all the dresses fitted like a glove. Betty then asked the assistant if we could find a couple of dresses for day wear that I could wear now. The assistant asked if I had anything in mind. I said I hadn't, so she suggested that my aunt should pick a couple out for me to try on. While Betty was choosing a dress for me to wear home, and some for my wardrobe, the assistant came back with some tan-colored tights and hold-up stockings for me to put on as it would look better under my dress. She asked if I would like the stockings or tights for now. I chose the stockings, and added the others to the shopping bag. I put my socks in a spare bag. I tried on several of the dresses that the assistant had brought in for me. She said they were a very popular style with the young girls who shopped there. As I checked myself out in the dressing room mirror, I did think that I made a very presentable young woman. Easily taken for a 16 or 17-year-old. Wearing one of the dresses, and keeping on one of the sets of undies and tights, we paid for our purchases. Well, Betty paid, but I would repay her later. Next stop Betty suggested was a shoe shop. We found several in the shopping mall, so the two of us went shoe shopping. I must admit that after the experience of buying the dresses and not the slightest hint of anything being amiss about me not being what I presented as, gave me a big boost to my confidence. We tried several shops. Betty asked the male shop assistant if he would help with choosing the right shoes for size and fit. He said he would be only too pleased to. He brought several styles for me to try. He sat me down on a chair while he sat on the footstool. He took my foot in his hand and slipped on the first pair of shoes. He could not resist caressing my foot as he did so, but I pretended not to notice. He asked me to stand up and walk around the shop, for comfort and fit. I sat down of the seat again, as he slipped off the first pair of shoes, and brought out the next pair to try on. As he lifted my foot to slip the shoe on, it was clear he could see right up my leg and probably my panties as well. When both shoes were fitted, I stood up and lifted my skirt to look at me feet, and as he was still sitting on the stool, it was clear he had a perfect view of my undies. I turned my back to him to see my reflection in the floor mirror and checked the back view of my shoes. He would clearly see my panty bottom. We settled on a couple of court shoes, with 2-inch heels. Laden down with the shopping bags, and still an hour and a half before we were due to meet up with Sarah, Betty suggested that I should see if the beauty salon could fit me in for a quick wash and dry for my hair. We luckily found one that had a free gap in their bookings. So I had my hair washed, trimmed and blow-dried. Then Betty and I with our shopping bags, made our way to Starbucks to meet up with Sarah. We found an empty corner and dropped our shopping behind the chairs while Betty ordered 2 lattes for us while we waited for Sarah to join us. Sarah arrived 10 minutes later with a young man with her. She introduced him as Graham, who was the son of one of her work colleagues. He was 19 and she said that he was home from uni for a few days, before going back, so she thought it would be nice for him to meet her teenage daughter, me. This was another surprise that Sarah and Betty had sprung on me. First I was Betty's niece, now I am my wife's teenage daughter and Betty is her aunt. To say that this was a complete surprise would be an understatement, but more was to come. Graham smiled a big beaming smile as we were introduced. He took my hand and held it for longer than was necessary, saying, "How lovely I look." Sarah also hugged me and whispered in my ear, "You look stunning, dear." Graham went to order fresh coffees for Sarah and himself. Sarah sat down next to Betty, leaving a seat for Graham next to me. "I love the new look, Alex. You look as lovely as a young girl." Graham returned with their 2 coffees. Sitting next to me, he chatted on about what had we been up to, my auntie and I, dress and shoe shopping and the hairdressers. After we had finished our coffees and getting ready to move, Graham asked if I was free for the rest of the day. Sarah answered for me, by saying that yes she is, so why don't we 2 young people get to know each other better? What about taking all the shopping bags home? I asked. Oh, Betty and I can manage them, as I am finished for today at the office. So it seemed as well as being her teenage daughter, she had it sorted for me to have a boyfriend as well. I did not know what to say. Graham on the other hand seemed very pleased to have me for the afternoon. Graham helped carry the shopping bags back to where we had left the car, then taking my hand, he said to Sarah, "Don't worry Mrs. Hunter, I will bring her home safe and sound." Sarah turned to me and asked if I was okay for money. "I think so," I said. Then she hugged me and whispered in my ear again, "Have fun, dear, and don't do anything naughty," then winked at me. Graham holding my hand led me off back to the shopping mall. I turned and waved to Sarah and Betty. When we got back to the mall, we ran into some of Graham's friends. He introduced me as Alex, one of his mother's work colleague's daughter, who had just moved into the area to join her mother. So I realized Sarah had this all planned from the start. So I thought, well, if they have no problems with seeing me as a teenage girl and wanting me to join them, at least I should enjoy the experience as well. Graham's friends were introduced, Debbie, John, Sammy and Connie. They were not couples, but just old friends who grew up together. So we did what most young people do when they have a bit of time on their hands. We browsed the record shops and the girls, and I looked around the dress shops. We finished up at another coffee shop all laughing and chatting together before it was time to make our way back to our homes. Graham insisted on taking me home in his dad's car, which he had borrowed. So saying goodbye to the others with hugs and kisses, and agreeing to meet again on Saturday, Graham took my hand and led me to where he had parked his dad's car. When we arrived back at my home, he asked if he could call for me on Saturday, and go out with him and his friends for the day. I asked that he should phone me the next day, Friday, to make sure I was free. As I was about to get out of his car, he reached over and kissed me on the lips. I felt all funny and tingly when his lips touched mine, and I kissed him back. I slipped my arms around his neck and kissed him harder this time. I was all flustered when I got out and ran to my front door. As he drove off, he waved and blew me a kiss. Sarah had the door open as I turned round to open the door myself, and she was grinning from ear to ear. "Oh wow," she said, "how's that for young love? We watched you two kissing in the car before you got out, and you looked as though you were enjoying it as well." That left me blushing, as it was true I had responded to his kisses and kissed him back. Sarah smiled as she said, "Alex, I really think that you are turning into a young girl." Then she added, "And I would be delighted to have you as my daughter, rather than as my husband." My mind was in a turmoil. Here I am, a 25-year-old man, married, dressing and living as a teenage girl, being kissed and kissing back a boy who was younger than myself, and my wife saying she would prefer me as a girl than as her husband. I asked her if she would really prefer to be my mother than my wife. She hugged me as she said, "Yes, darling, every time, and Betty would love to have you back as her niece." So it seemed they had already accepted that I would be their new daughter and niece respectively. So, now comes the problems of sorting out all the legal paperwork side. All my papers would say that I am a 25-year-old male, but how to change that to read a 16-year-old female? I would still be able to run my internet business, as my gender was not an issue there of course, and my name would still be Alex Hunter, as would Sarah's. The first thing we had to sort out was getting the marriage annulled. This turned out easier than we thought, as it was mostly done online with the internet. But changing my name from Mr. to Miss was a bit more complicated, as it had to be done through a court of law, and needed searches done to make sure there was no hidden prosecutions pending or outstanding financial matters unresolved. It was not until all these issues had been cleared that finally I was able to appear in front of a panel of judges as my female self, plus with a psychiatrist to speak on my sound mind, that finally I legally became Miss Alexandria Hunter, female. The date of birth was blurred to read that I was 7 years younger than I actually was. But all this was to come later. I was still in my early stages of being a teenage girl, and being asked out on a date by another teenager, Graham. All these new experiences and the news that I am now seen as Sarah's daughter has changed my situation at home. Sarah and Betty had already started by moving me into my own girls' room, with my new clothes already placed in my wardrobe, dresses, skirts, blouses and slacks. In a chest of drawers they had filled with panties and bras, stockings and tights, suspenders and girdles. In fact, they must have been planning this for a long time, to have all these items of clothing already sorted out in the spare room, now Alexandria's room. A dressing table with a big mirror, my makeup and hair essentials in the drawers. A full-length mirror on the wardrobe and several pairs of suitable shoes for day and evening wear. Clearly this had been planned for me, over a long time, and I had no idea any of this was happening. All day Friday, Sarah and Betty had been explaining how after Sarah had learned of my early years as a girl, it had explained her feelings towards me, not so much as a boyfriend but more as a girlfriend, and when she had seen the photos Betty had showed us, she realized that she would rather have me as her daughter than as her husband, so she and Betty had planned this for some time, giving me back the lost years of growing up as a girl. After seeing me, dressed as a schoolgirl, they knew they had made the right choice, and then seeing me kissing Graham, they knew I was already a girl deep down inside myself. True to his word, Graham did call me to find out if I was still happy to go out on a date with him and his friends on Saturday. My answer to him was, "Oh yes, when can you pick me up?" He said he would be along around noon on Saturday. When I came off the phone I was all a dither and I could feel my face was all flushed. Sarah had overheard what I was saying to Graham on the phone, and she said that I would have to get used to being her daughter now, so I would have to change my mindset and start calling her Mum or Mummy. Yes, Mummy, I laughed back at her. I was all excited about my date with Graham, and could not decide what to wear. Mum, Sarah, came to the rescue by suggesting that as it was a daytime date with Graham's and his other friends, I should not be dressy, but girly casual, so suggested a pleated skirt just above the knees, ankle socks and sneakers, one of my new bra and panty sets, and a t-shirt, the one with the butterfly on it. Gosh, I was excited. We all settled down to our evening meal and then relaxed watching a bit of television. But I was still thinking of tomorrow and what could follow over the next few months. I was restless watching television, so I told Mum and Betty I was going to have a bath then go to bed. I ran a nice bubble bath and sorted out my nightwear. Mom had bought me a pink chiffon shorty nightdress and panty set. I got undressed and put on the wrap that was hanging behind my bedroom door, cleaned off what bit of makeup I had on with face cleanser and went into the bathroom for my soak. I lay in the warm sweet-smelling bubble bath, soaking and thinking how lucky I was to have found myself and be supported by the two people I love in my life. After a relaxing soak, I checked out for any sign of hair on my arms and legs, and with my lady razor, shaved any last vestige of hair, leaving my skin soft and smooth. Getting out of the bath, and pulling out the plug to drain away the bath water, I toweled myself dry, then rubbed some body lotion into my elbows and knees and then over the rest of my body. When the bath had emptied, I rinsed it down with the shower head, wrapped a towel around myself and returned to my bedroom. I dropped the towel on the floor and checked myself out in the full-length mirror. Apart from the obvious slight bulge between my legs, I did have the body of a young girl. My breasts were quite well developed, and my hips certainly had a more feminine curve. Slipping on my short nightdress and panties, I got into bed and soon fell asleep, thinking about what comes next. Saturday, I awoke with the bright sunshine filling my room with light. Oh, happy day, I thought, as I looked around my new Alexandria's room. My towel still where I had left it on the floor from the night before, my dressing table with its girly paraphernalia spread across it. I could see into my wardrobe through the open door, my dresses, and I knew, also hanging up were my skirts and blouses, with my shoes neatly racked across the floor of the wardrobe. I glanced at my bedside clock. It was 10 o'clock. Time to get up. I was up and in my wrap, and on my way downstairs to the kitchen. When Mom popped her head round the kitchen door, I see you're up at last, you sleepy head. She smiled at me. What time is your date calling for you? He said they would be here for noon, I responded. As I sat at the kitchen table, Mom brought me a coffee and some toast. Just then Betty came in and kissed me good morning. Betty asked if I would like her to do my hair for me when I was dressed. Oh yes, please. After my bit of breakfast, I returned to my room to get dressed. I had decided on my butterfly patterned bra and panties along with my butterfly t-shirt, the pleated pale blue skirt that came just above my knees, ankle socks and my pink sneakers. When I was dressed, I called down to Betty that I was ready. I put a touch of powder on my face and some lip color. Betty came in and brushed out my hair and put it into bunches on either side of my head. I really did look like a teenager. Just on noon, I heard a car drive up, then our doorbell chime. Betty gave me a hug as I rushed down to greet my date. As I opened the door, Graham stood there looking all nice and fresh in his sports tan slacks, coffee-colored t-shirt, and his trainers. The others were in the car waving a greeting, so I waved back. Graham said, "Wow, you look great." "So do you," I told him and kissed him on the lips, to whoops from the car. Mom and Betty watched from the window as we drove off. I was in front with Graham. Debbie and John were in the back, and Graham explained that we were meeting Sammy and Connie at the mall. The same friends I had met on Thursday. We arrived at the mall parking, parked the car and went off to find the other two. Graham took my hand as we followed the others. I looked at his smiling face. I could see he was very happy with my company, and to be truthful, I was quite taken with his. For some reason, I found myself enjoying the experience of being a girl with her boyfriend, and by the time we ran into the others, I had taken it for granted that I was Graham's girl. I felt all tingly inside at the thought. The other two girls were dressed very similar to myself, with shortish skirts, ankle socks, sneakers, and t-shirts, and our hair in either bunches or ponytails. The two girls noticed that I did not have pieced ears, so grabbed my arms and took me into a beauty salon to get them pieced the same as theirs. When I came out, I had 2 studs in each ear and a bottle of clinical spirits to keep them clean and to help the healing. We caught up with the boys and browsed the shops, mostly clothes and music shops, I had to admit. But I was really enjoying my newfound lifestyle. I felt that I was making up for lost time since being turned back into a boy at the age of 8 years. Each time I looked at Graham, or held his hand, or he put his arm around my waist, I felt at home, being a girl. We finished at one of the many coffee shops in the mall. As we drank our coffees, between us we were trying to decide where to go next. Graham mentioned that there were a couple of good films at the local multi-screen cinema, and he fancied going to see one of them later. I said I would love to go myself, but would need to go home first and change into something fresh. As the others said they had other plans for that evening, it was just Graham and I going to the cinema. After we broke up for the afternoon, Graham took me home and arranged to call back for me at 7. He could not stop touching me all afternoon, holding my hand, putting his arms around my waist, giving me quick kisses, and when he dropped me off outside my home, he gave me a long lingering kiss. Sarah wanted to know all that had happened while we were out, so as I got my clothes sorted for the evening, I told her about having my ears pieced, and meeting Graham later for an evening at the pictures. Sarah suggested that to be on the safe side, because of my unique situation when with boys, I should wear a panty liner in my panties, to give the impression I was having a monthly. I knew what monthlies were of course, but never thought of myself having to pretend that I had them, but of course it would make sense if we both got carried away, and I would have an excuse for him not to go into my knickers. I sorted out a nice dress. It was my new chiffon dress with the pleated skirt and cap sleeves, with a cream background and floral pattern all over, with a matching pale blue jacket, bra and panties, with a suspender belt and stockings, and my court shoes. I had a quick shower, remembering to keep my hair dry under a shower cap. I toweled myself dry, massaged my favorite body lotion into my skin, and then went to get dressed. By now of course I was very experienced at dressing as Alexandria, so I was soon dressed and ready for my date, a touch of makeup, and a sprig of perfume on my wrist and neck and under my dress. Slip on my shoes and I was ready. I did a twirl in front of Sarah and Betty, who told me I looked lovely. Graham was right on time. Sarah opened the door to him and ushered him in. He looked at me and said, "Oh, wow, you look gorgeous." I blushed at his comments, gave him a quick kiss on the cheek, said bye to Mum and Betty, and then left on Graham's arm. The film we had chosen to see was from the Twilight series on television and books. Graham bought the tickets and we waited for the start of the program in the bar area, where we both had a Coke, while we waited for the call for the show. I must admit I felt quite special being there with Graham. Even in my court shoes he was still a couple of inches taller than me. He told me how beautiful he thought I looked and added that he wasn't the only one who thought so, as I was getting quite a few admiring glances from some of the other guys there. I had to giggle at that, as I did not think I looked that special. We got the call that our program was about to start. So all those with tickets for Screen 1, take their seats. Graham put his arm around me as we made our way to Screen 1. We had one of those double seats on the back row, which was in the dark when the theater lights went down. Once we had settled in our seats, Graham put his arm around my shoulders, as I sat on his left and I placed my arm around his waist and put my head on his shoulder. There were other couples in the row of double seats with us at the back. Once the theater lights went down, the back 2 rows were in complete darkness. By the time the main feature started, you could hear lots whisperings of voices and clothing. I almost fell asleep snuggled up to Graham, as I was so happy and warm in his embrace. Once the main feature started I became quite engrossed in the film, and hardly noticed when Graham softly caressed my legs under my dress. I looked up at him when I realized and he kissed me gently on my lips. As I moved into his embrace, his hand moved up my stockings to my inner thigh. I opened my mouth to say stop and his tongue probed my lips. I trapped his hand in my thighs, and whispered to him, "No, Graham, I have my period." He took the advice, and moved his hand back to caressing my stockings. I squeezed his waist to show my thanks. I looked up at him and he kissed me lovingly on my lips, then buried his face in my hair. As we watched the rest of the film, he carefully redid up his trousers. He was so sweet and I loved him.